Hello. So this video is going to focus on two main concepts that I want you to understand. So the first half of the video, I'm going to talk about balance and how to create a radially balanced design. And then the second half of the video is going to introduce you to watercolor pencils and how you can use watercolor pencils when you paint and make a watercolor painting. So to talk about balance and introduce balance, I've got a handout here created by the artclasscurator.com. Balance is a principle of design or a principle of art. So balance refers to how the weight in a composition is distributed. And there are three main types of balance. There's symmetrical balance, where the left half is symmetrical to the right half or a mirror image. So whatever you do on one side, you flip and have the same thing on the other. Asymmetrical balance just simply means like not symmetrical, not a mirror image. So even though we may have like something bigger, okay, on one half, it is balanced out by something either smaller or something of equal importance on the other. So it's not a mirror image, kind of like in this artwork by James Abbott McNeill Whistler. This would be an asymmetrically balanced design just because of how everything is arranged. It still feels like we have an equal amount of weight on the left side as the right side. It's just not done in a way that's a mirror image. And the type of balance that we are going to focus on for our particular design is radial balance. So with radial balance, you have a midpoint and everything is equally arranged around that midpoint. Okay, so that is what I want to focus on for this first part of the video. So supplies that you're going to need to begin with, just to kind of evenly divide your page and make sure that it is truly radial. We want to work on a square sheet of paper because a square is going to enable us to find a midpoint a little bit easier. You're going to need a ruler, you're going to need a pencil, and then I also want you to have a protractor. So the first thing that I'm going to do, just to kind of help me find my midpoint, is as lightly as possible, I'm going to use a ruler, and I'm going to draw a line that goes all the way across my page. Now, one of the quickest ways to find the midpoint is just to line your ruler up with the corners. Okay, and make a big X across the page, and where all those line up will be the midpoint. Okay, now want to have you use a protractor. Protractors are typically used when we think about a circle and kind of evenly dividing things in a circle. So because radial balance creates balance in a circular design, I do want you to understand how to use a protractor and evenly divide a circle up and create the same number of segments on each side. So the way a protractor works, this is a protractor. You've got this little line here at the bottom, so it kind of comes here in the middle and on the side. And so that is going to go right on the line that we drew. So this is why it's important to draw a line all the way across the page. Okay, and then we've got kind of like a little crosshair here inside a circle. The midpoint that I just found goes inside that. And now the next thing that we need to do is we need to decide how many segments do you want in your radial design. I'm going to encourage you to do at least 6 or more segments. I am going to do, I'll make 12. Okay, so if I want 12, we need to think in terms of like a half circle. Okay, so this protractor goes all the way from like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 degrees, all the way up to 180. Okay, because a full circle is 360 degrees, and a protractor is going to go around halfway around to 180 degrees. Okay, so then I need to take however many number of segments that I want. So in my case, if I want 12 segments, I need to divide that by 2, because I'm going to do 6 segments on one side and 6 on the other, because 12 divided by 2 is 6. So if you were going to do, I would recommend you choose an even number. You don't have to, but it makes the math come out a little bit easier. So if I wanted 6 sections, I would, do 3 on this half and 3 on the other. If I wanted 8 sections, you create more work on yourself if you choose a odd number. So we take 180 degrees because we have 100 and it's what half a circle is. And I'm going to divide that by 6. Okay, so if I have 180 divided by 6, I'm left with 30. So to divide this up, I'm going to count every 30 degrees. So I'm going to go 10, 20, 30, and I'm going to put a tiny little knot. And I'm going to count again, 10, 20, 30, tiny dot, 10, 20, 30. And I'm going to do that all the way around until I get all the way up to 180. Okay, so 180 is going to be right here. Now I'm going to flip my protractor. I'm going to line it up on my section, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. Okay, so I'm going to count 10, 20, 30. And I'm going to do that all the way around again. Now, I cannot stress this enough. Okay, we're not actually drawing this design. Okay, we are going to paint it. So even though I'm having you sketch and divide this out, draw your pencil lines as lightly as possible. As lightly as possible. I cannot say that enough. Okay, now I think it's a little bit easier if you actually pencil these segments and sections in. You can kind of cover those up or paint over them so you don't see them. But I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line my ruler up with one of the dots, the midpoint, the dot. And I'm going to draw as lightly as possible a line all the way around. Okay, so again, you do want to make sure that you line up all 3, dot, midpoint, dot, and divide that around. Okay, so continue this process all the way around until you have evenly divided this square and this page into the number of segments you decided you wanted in your radial design. All right, so I've got this divided into 12 equal sections. All right, at this point, you may want to pause your video, open your instruction sheet, and double check and see what the materials are that you need. And assemble those. We actually are going to need a very small amount of materials for this project. Okay, so we've already taped your paper down to the surface. You've got your 6-inch by 6-inch sheet of watercolor paper, masking tape to tape that down. And then you are also going to want to get watercolor pencils. So we've got 2 sets. I've got like the 24 count set and the 12 count set. It really just depends on how many colors you want. There's no advantage to doing one versus the other than if you just want a lot of colors. You are also going to want a paintbrush, maybe multiple sizes, depending on if you want a big area, small area. You need a cup of water. And then I would also make sure that you have a towel. Now, nice thing about the watercolor pencils is they actually include the instructions about the different ways you can use them on the back of the box. Okay, so we can use watercolor pencils with a wet brush. We can use the watercolor pencils as a wet pencil. We can use them on wet paper. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a color. So any color that you want. So I'm going to choose this lovely magenta. Okay, and so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use it with a wet brush. So you're either going to draw a picture or shade something in with the watercolor pencils. So nice thing about this also is with this particular lesson, it is going to require you to focus on your shading skills a little bit, depending on what you want to draw. All right, so I am going to, in every other segment, okay, because I'm creating a radial design, so I'm going to repeat things all the way around this midpoint. I am going to shade this in all the way around. So to save time on the video, I'm going to pause. I'm going to continue this around with my magenta colored pencil, and I'm going to shade every other one to look identical to that little part I've already shaded. Okay, so I added a little bit more. I decided that I wanted a little bit of color on the outside also, so I could do both places. So in addition to going all the way around my midpoint and shading with the magenta colored pencil and kind of fading that out, I also did the same thing with blue, and I did that in the opposite sections of the magenta. Okay, so to use watercolor pencils with a wet brush, this is a cool thing about watercolor pencils that I like, is you are going to draw, shade, color something in, and then all we're going to do is we're going to dip our paintbrush in water, and I am going to use a wet paint, just my wet paintbrush, and when I apply the water to the watercolor pencils, it is going to mix and blend the pigment. Okay, so we can't actually do this with regular colored pencils. Regular colored pencils will not actually dissolve and mix with water like watercolor pencils will. So you do have to get, special watercolor pencils for this. Okay, but we just draw on top, and then you can blend that in with a paintbrush. So one reason some students and people, other artists like watercolor pencils as opposed to just using watercolors is if you feel like you are a little bit better artist at drawing, or maybe you feel like you have a little bit more control at drawing and shading things than you do with a paintbrush, you can use watercolor pencils to draw, shade, and control the areas that you want your color. And you can then use the paintbrush and the water to go in and mix and blend that way. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to use this wet brush, and I am going to mix in each of these little sections. I'm just going to mix and blend this out so that it looks darker on the outside edges and then gradually gets lighter towards the middle. So kind of like a graded wash, only I am doing the graded wash with shading with a watercolor pencil. So I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and continue to paint and add some water and fill this in. I'm going to do the same with my magenta, and then I'm going to show you a next technique with the watercolor pencils. Okay, so I just spent a lot of time just dipping my paintbrush in water and kind of blending over that. So the nice thing is, depending on how much water you use and how much you decide to blend, you can still potentially see like some of the textures that we've got from the colored pencil, or you can totally blend that out. Okay, so the next way to use watercolor pencils, if we're taking a look at the back of our box, is we're going to use it on wet paper. So I'm going to jump down to number 3. So you're going to wet your paper with a clean brush, and then we're going to draw on the wet paper with the pencils and try blending. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to work one section at a time, and I'm just going to kind of re-wet this area. And I'm going to wet the whole section just so it looks more uniform. And I am going to just draw on that. So one thing that will happen that you will notice is, as you do this, it's going to kind of start to like dissolve the tip of the pencil a little bit. So I'm going to try to, one thing it recommends that we try to do is try to like blend colors. So I'm going to attempt to draw a tiny little sphere, and I'm going to use like hatching and cross hatching around with this and just try to blend that up. Okay, so in each of the blue sections, I'm going to go through and do a tiny sphere, and then out here in the magenta sections, I'm going to draw a cone. Okay, so I will start with the yellow, and then I will use my green on the edges and try to blend and mix in that way. And then I'll come back again with my yellow. And it's really a lot like shading with a colored pencil. Or it's kind of like a cross between a colored pencil and a marker. Okay, so you've got like a little bit more control than what you might have with a marker, because you can kind of mix and blend and move the color around because it is a wet surface. Okay, so whatever it is that you decide to do, and we want to be really careful that we're not, try to be cautious that you're not like ripping the paper up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause. You might also kind of experiment the difference between drawing on like a damp paper versus a wet paper. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to add this exact same thing inside every little section of my design so it creates our radial design. Okay, so I have completely finished going all the way around, trying to do little spherical and conical shapes. So shapes that look like a sphere and a cone. And so one thing you'll notice, they don't all look like exactly identical. So that is like really important for your design, that everything really looks the same. You can be a little bit more intentional and deliberate about like spacing. So one thing you'll notice, like on some of these, my spacing is a little bit closer to the edge of the paper, say on, some of these out here. But for the most part, we are blending and fading, but kind of repeating the same thing in an even way around your midpoint. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do, we're going to use these as a wet pencil. Okay, so this one is probably my least favorite, and the main reason it's my least favorite is because I feel like I have to sharpen my pencil way more when I use this. If you need to sharpen your pencil, I really would prefer we not use the watercolor pencils in the pencil sharpeners. Come see me. I have little handheld pencil sharpeners that we can use. But this is going to create kind of a controlled line. You're going to be able to, depending on how sharp your pencil is, draw, but it's going to make like a bold line and a bold detail. So I'm going to work with a violet colored pencil and a black colored pencil. Okay, so all I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my colored pencil and I'm going to dip the end of that in there, and being careful not to, ruin the rest of my design. I'm just going to dip this in and just draw, and it's going to create, like I said, like a much bolder line, so you'll be able to see the difference between when you start to run out of water. Where the water is will create a much thicker, bolder line, and then as that dries, it will create a much thinner line. Okay, so after I dip this a couple times, it may not be as necessary. You also want to be careful. So like these are the last two that I did. So kind of like we talked about with previous assignments, like when we did the explosion book, remember the watercolor pencils are going to work in a very similar way as the watercolor paints. So with that in mind, if I draw with a wet pencil, okay, on wet paper, I'm going to get a small amount of bleeding, okay, versus if I draw with my wet pencil onto the dry paper. And I am going to kind of turn this. And the last thing I'm going to do is look and see and kind of compare the length of my lines. Okay, so whatever we draw in one section, just repeat that evenly around, whether that be every other section, every 2 or 3 sections, however that may be. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to my violet, and I'm just going to dip that in and continue that out. And the violet's not quite as dark as the black. I continue that around. Okay, so at this point, you are simply going to finish this design. I'm going to add a couple more details, and then you will be able to see the finished artwork. This one definitely takes the most time, mainly because it's going to take you a little bit of time to go around and create that radial design, divide that up with the protractor, and then depending on how many details you want to make into this design, that could take you some time as well. So this is just an introduction to using watercolor pencils. Shading and using a wet brush on top of them, drawing on wet paper with them, and then also dipping the pencil and using it as a wet pencil. So that is it. That is all of the techniques associated with this particular painting.